Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry Congressman Lance couldn't join us. Leonard is a great friend and he's been a great supporter of the rare disease community, but I'm sure he'll be here with us again at another time. As Howard indicated, the title of my talk is The Impact of PDUFA V and New Government Policies in the Orphan Drug Industry and Marketplace. So that's kind of a broad topic. And what I'm not going to make this is a wonkish talk or a policy talk or one deep in regulatory language. What I really want to address is with the backdrop of innovation and where we are at this nexus of drug development with all the key players involved, from patient groups to the NIH, the FDA, us in industry and others. How do we foster innovation and how do we accelerate timelines for drug development in the orphan space for everyone who needs a medicine with a rare disease and for every disease out there, all 7,000 in the years to come? So to do that in the 25 or so minutes I have, I will break this talk into three parts. I'll talk first a little bit of how we got here to where we are with FDASIA and PDUFA V and the current environment. We'll talk a little bit about where we are now, what does it mean, highlight a little bit of this legislation and just call out some key pieces of it and their impact. And then in the balance of my time, talk a little bit about what's ahead. How can we use this legislation, this new paradigm? What I really do think is the dawn of a new era in drug development, particularly in the rare diseases, but then also talk a little bit about what's missing and what are the challenges. So how did we get here? You know, we all know the history of rare disease drug development, and in many respects, it was really from the late 80s to about the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, where you had this first new era of drug development. So with the new medicines, the understanding of human genetics, with the understanding of proteins, with the first medicine in a lysosomal storage disorder, Ceridase by Genzyme and eventually Cerezyme and then others, you really had that first golden age. And in many respects, it was the first time you can actually implement what was the intent of Congress in putting out the Orphan Drug Act, to accelerate research, to drive innovation. We piggybacked a lot in those early days on what the HIV and AIDS community had done with the approval of some of the early medicines, AZT in 1989, and then the implementation in 1991 of Subpart H, which allowed the approval of medicines based on surrogate markers likely to predict clinical benefit, not used very often in the rare disease space, but used exceptionally well in the HIV world, which led to small incremental improvements in the AIDS community, eventually now leading to these combination of advanced therapies that in many ways have led to HIV being a long-term manageable chronic condition. So we get to 2000 and the stock market's on a tear and biotech is on a tear, and you've got a whole new part of biotech with genomics out there and people trying to understand how do you actually apply all these great new tool sets. And biotech is an amazing business in many respects. And if you ever try to explain our business model to any of your friends or family who don't understand it, and try to explain a little bit about all the money we raise, all the work we do, and how almost everything we do, despite raising millions, sometimes billions of dollars, building the best plants and facilities, hiring the best and the brightest people, given the nature of science and medicine, almost everything we do, it doesn't work. And companies like ours in the early stage of development, even in our first decade or more, you don't generate revenues and you don't make profits. And when it's overvalued, biotech can be remarkably overvalued. And when it's undervalued, I think it's also remarkably undervalued. So you get to 2000 and you had the stock market bubble burst, the first time the stock market bubble burst, and we got caught up in that in biotechnology. So that was the first extra event that happened from a macro perspective that began to change the course and the trajectory we were on for drug development. And then something very specific to our industry happened 4 years later when Vioxx began to be recalled from the market and the safety concerns came out around Vioxx. And you saw the FDA pendulum shift even further toward the side of safety and prevention of harm to patients. And we in the orphan and rare disease community got caught up in that. And we started to live in an environment where the regulators were becoming increasingly tied to the notions of safety and efficacy, and first and foremost safety, and in many diseases that's certainly appropriate, but particularly difficult in our environment. And so we tried to muddle through it. I came to Amicus in early 2005, so after the 2000 bubble in biotech and the market broadly had burst, after Vioxx and the swinging of the pendulum. But in our company, we got it funded on some really neat science, very early stage. And we knew back in 2004 when we were putting the business plans together that if some part of it worked, it could change outcomes for people and maybe offer some benefit. And we were able to get that company funded, and many other companies funded, despite the 2000 and 2004 setbacks. And then the next great macro event happened, the greatest macro event of many generations, with the market crash and the financial crisis of 2008. Money is the lifeblood of what we do. It funds the research at the NIH. Charitable giving funds much academic research, and obviously venture capital coming into early stage companies in the biotech space. Much changed in 2008 from a macro perspective. So in that 8-year cycle, we had gone through 2 major macro events. One event, the effect of which across the board was really to begin to change the whole risk-benefit analysis for investors in the community. And so as capital dries up, you start to look at an environment in which our industry becomes not so attractive. People have always understood the risk, but when the reward was so far out or so marginal at best, money into the industry started to dry up. So you had it at both ends of the funnel. You had early stage research and the start of new exciting technologies, the moving of those technologies from academic settings to industry, virtually come to a standstill in 2009, early 2010. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there wasn't much happening in the drug approval area. And if you asked anybody, whether they were from a large company working in the orphan space or any space in pharma or biotech, to the earliest stage investors, more and more what you began to hear was, okay, we understand the macro environment. At least for now, there's not a lot we can do to change that. But boy, at that other end of the funnel, we don't know what to expect from the FDA. We don't know what the rules are. Oftentimes, if there are rules and we have agreements, they change it. They change the rules in the middle of the game. And it's that uncertainty that was just so frustrating. So as we started to think in early 2010, what can we do to change it? I kind of had a unique perspective. I wore my dad hat sometimes as a patient advocate involved with a lot of patient advocacy groups, and also my entrepreneur hat as a member of the bio board and as a CEO of a small biotech company. And I really sensed this growing frustration, this sense of unease that the Titanic was going down. And a lot of the little changes that were being proposed were really just shuffling the deck chairs. I heard it at patient meetings, patient groups, and then finally, you kind of had this groundswell of activity, and I saw it at some of the bio board meetings when we began to talk about the reauthorization of PDUFA V. And the original view was, let's have some small changes, maybe we get an extra meeting out of the FDA, maybe a little better definition of some timelines, we get new funding with the reauthorization. And we were at a board meeting about 2.5 years ago in New York, and a number of us who were the CEOs of smaller to mid-sized companies kind of raised this issue of, you know, the ship is going down, folks, and we can't get these medicines approved, we can't get them funded. If we don't move for substantial change, we may never have this opportunity again. In the meantime, you started to see patient groups. You saw some of the work that NORD was doing. You saw new patient groups. You saw the RDLA be formed, Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. You saw the passion of physicians and entrepreneurs who were then patient advocates as well, like Emil Caucus, one of the founders of BioMarin, and a foundation that he put together, the Every Life Foundation, the Global Genes Project. You saw some of the established patient groups, Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, the MDA, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, all with the same message. And it was a really remarkable thing to witness when you'd go to these patient meetings and you'd hear these, you know, sometimes you'd hear just awful human stories about people with children who were suffering, who could not get access to medicine. You'd hear about companies that had to close up shop because they couldn't raise the next dollar, and that was a really unique phenomenon. Usually biotech companies never filed for bankruptcy. We always kind of reinvented ourselves, or in the worst case scenario, maybe partnered off or sold assets on the cheap. But in 2009, 2010, you're actually seeing bankruptcies. There are a lot of heroes who came together to make what became PDUFA V and the key elements for the rare disease community happen. There were tremendous patient advocates. Industry came together, first spurred by the board at Bio and really championed by Jim Greenwood, who did a remarkable job on behalf of the entire industry and certainly as a tireless advocate for those who live and work in the rare diseases. You saw the National Venture Capital Association step up. And by the summer of 2010, we had our first hearing in front of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, Ted Kennedy's old committee, the HELP Committee. I had the honor with a number of folks to testify, and it was a range from the FDA to patient advocates to entrepreneurs. And the title of that hearing was The State of Pediatric Research in Rare Diseases. And from all those different constituencies, you heard the same message again, and a lot of it really focused on this regulatory environment, but everything that it affected, from the financing to the hiring of people to partnerships, all the aspects of what we do in the industry. And it was also the most remarkably bipartisan effort that I've ever seen. We put together a rare disease caucus, which Congressman Lance is the Republican co-chair in the House, Congressman Joe Crowley, a Democrat from Queens, no relation, he's much better looking. We put all that together, and in the Senate side, you started to see folks like Sherrod Brown, a progressive Democrat from Ohio, and Senator Sam Brownback, a conservative Republican from Kansas, coming together and working together on this legislation. It was a real testament to so many people. And with that, we now have what was signed into law enacted by Congress, signed by the President last summer. We have our PDUFA V and FDASIA as part of that. And again, I won't go through all the details, but there were over 300 patient organizations who voiced their support for various provisions. And if you look at some of the key provisions, you look at the Creating Hope Act, was sponsored and the original brainchild of Kids versus Cancer. The Ultra Fast, spearheaded by Emil and the Every Life Foundation. The Expert Act, championed by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. The very significant Breakthrough Therapies Act that came to us, the idea of the Friends of Cancer Research, and the whole notion of patient participation and medical project discussions provision that was championed by Pat Furlong and PPMD. Every one of these pieces, and all of which we never thought would ever be part of this, and we were told it could never be part of PDUFA V, it has to stand alone, leave it alone. Every single one of these patient-originated ideas came into PDUFA V and FDASIA. Other ideas like further articulating accelerated approval pathways, that came from the Bio Board and bioindustry. So the upshot is, as we come into what I really do think driven by tremendous science and medicine, is this new era in medicine. So that's how we got here. We've got this great new tool set, and now we're all trying to figure out what do we do with it. We really have struggled to try to figure out, with all these different pieces, what does it mean for we as drug developers? And right now, we're not entirely sure, and that's probably okay. It's evolving. I think what will end up happening is, in many respects, all these different pieces of legislation provide some new tool sets to regulators. They could provide a better understanding of what regulatory pathways, especially the accelerated pathways, could be for industry, and very importantly, for people who invest in this field to understand exactly how long it's going to take to get a drug approved, what the likely indication is going to be and how broad the market, and have some sense of what the pricing power may be so they can build economic models and try to appreciate all of that. Last year, the FDA approved 39 new drugs. Some of them were terrific new drugs in the rare diseases. Early in 2012, we saw Kalydeco from Vertex approved for cystic fibrosis, a truly disease-modifying approach, a great new innovation in medicine, and much to the credit of Peggy Hamburg and her leadership and Janet Woodcock and their vision and leadership. And I really am really pleased, and I say this as a parent, a patient advocate, and an entrepreneur, with what I see over the last couple of years is an enormous effort on behalf of the leadership at FDA to recognize the problem with us and to try to solve it together. And it's going to take time. As we sit here today, there are over 5,000 drugs in clinical research in the United States, 800 in late stages of therapy. You go from Vertex in early 2012 to the very end of 2012, Agerion's approval of Juxtapid, and now as we sit here in 2013, you have some very exciting data coming out in Duchenne muscular dystrophy from Sarepta and Prosensa. To think even 3 or 5 years ago that we may be on the cusp of effectively treating a disease as horrible as Duchenne muscular dystrophy and all those boys who suffer from it, that's really exciting. And for as hard as this business may be and working in an area where almost nothing ever works, that's really rewarding. And I think at the end of the day, a good part of why we do what we do. I try not to say at the end of the day in talks and speeches because I'm afraid someday I'm going to wake up and it's going to be at the end of the day and I'm not going to know what to do next. So all those different pieces that we talked about, especially the breakthrough therapies, I think as that evolves, and Kalydeco was the first to receive breakthrough designation, I think what that's really, again, going to be able to do is if you're a company like Amicus and you're developing tremendously innovative therapies in areas of rare diseases, huge unmet needs, it's not that you're going to get a breakthrough therapy designation anytime soon and somebody's going to be able to say, oh, boy, this is super valuable because this company has that designation for that drug, therefore A, B, and C are going to happen. We don't know. But what we do know is an explicit statement from FDA working together with the company and oftentimes the patient groups to highlight the fact that we've got a problem here in whatever the disease area may be. And this is a really creative, innovative solution for it. And what I'm hopeful for is that companies like ours will be able to have orphan drug designation and breakthrough drug designation and fast-track designation and accelerated approval, and that will also open up a whole set of tool sets for the examiners and regulators at FDA. But I think it will also be a series of checks in the boxes where people who we work with, potential partners, people in the patient community who want to see these medicines accelerated, investors can look at this and say, okay, with all of that, and now we're also talking maybe about special medical use designations, approvals based for very specific designated populations on phase 2 data. With all of that, that's probably going to mean that this drug is going to get approved faster than others, and it's something where it comes out is really going to be a benefit for patients. So I think in time, once we have examples of this, and there are a dozen or a couple of dozen of the Kalydeco and Juxtapid examples, then I think particularly investors can look at this and say, okay, this is a really unique area, and I think in many respects we're seeing that again in the Duchenne field. But it's all evolving, and it's evolving in real time. With everything that went into PDUFA V and FDASIA, though, I still think the most significant change is going to be implemented this fall, and that's this new framework for the FDA to move away from just a strict safety and efficacy analysis and to finally begin to articulate and then approve medicines based on a risk-benefit analysis, which I think in the rare disease community is going to be of enormous benefit. One of my colleagues who I worked with on the bio board, who's also chairman of the National Venture Capital Association, Jonathan Leff, who was a real champion for all of this change, said recently that breakthrough approval and accelerated approval are good and important, but this benefit-risk framework cuts across all of it and gets to the core challenge that FDA faces. So I would encourage us to pay, as a community, very close attention to what's coming out to be a standardized way for reviewers to consider the benefit and risk for new drugs and biologics using a handful of decision factors, things that we talk about all the time in the rare and orphan disease community. So we talk about very, very rare populations. We talk about unmet need, severity of disease, mortality, lack of alternatives. These are things that regulators need to build into this new paradigm. And if we help them do it correctly, and we continue to be good drug developers and do studies, and this doesn't always mean that, gee, you get a drug in, you put it in 5 or 10 or 12 people, and it looks like it works, and boy, without it, people are going to suffer and die. It means for we as industry especially, we can't stop there, and it doesn't mean that every study is going to get approved on a handful of patients. Oftentimes you need to do the more robust phase 3 studies, but if we could do it in a way that makes sense, to use biomarkers, to break down challenges, not just with FDA, but at the IRBs, where I could tell you as a company, we spend more time, effort, and money working with multiple challenges from all the different institutional review boards. If we can do a lot of that, and I think against the framework of this risk-benefit analysis that, from what the agency tells us, is going to be implemented this fall, and they're holding hearings right now and will for some time to come. The White Oak hearings were first held in October of 2012, and I think much to the Commissioner and Dr. Woodcock's credit, they are including patients and patient advocacy organizations, oftentimes in very private sessions. And I think that will be to the benefit of all of us. So we're in a very good place, but it's not perfect. So going forward, there are a handful of challenges. One is very immediate, and it's this whole notion of sequestration. So we're all familiar with the basic principles that Congress and the White House couldn't get together and figure a way to manage our finances better. So instead, what they ended up doing is putting this draconian across-the-board cut. And it's all pending and scheduled to take effect here very shortly. It has profound implications for drug development and for the rare disease community. The budget sequestration will cut 8.2% from the federal budget. That means $320 million less in federal spending for the FDA in fiscal year 2013. The Commissioner is still working to determine the effect on FDA staffing. Right now, the way that it's actually structured, the fees that we as industry pay in is our PDUFA fees that were designed to increase the resources and help us accelerate innovation and timelines at FDA. Even the money that we put in separate from all the taxes that we pay, that money also gets sequestered without any proportionate benefit to the FDA review process. So the concern, of course, is that these cuts can run against exactly what Congress was trying to fix and what the FDA was trying to fix, shortening the timelines, putting more resources in areas where they're needed. So all eyes are on the sequestration issue, and it is so very frustrating. Could you imagine running your business and realizing, okay, you work with your board, we've got to cut spending, okay? Got to cut spending by so much, fine. Well, we don't know where to cut it, we can't agree on where to cut it, so we're going to take everything and put an across-the-board axe on it. So all of our really crappy programs, they're going to continue and still get most of their funding. All of our great programs are going to get less. It just makes absolutely no sense, and I know there are some good people working on it, and I just hope and pray that they can come to a solution, because if they don't, it's going to have very, very serious consequences for what we're doing to just get off the ground and begin to implement what's in the legislation. Going forward, too, I think our challenge is to not rest. We have to continue to realize that science and medicine is progressing at a terrific rate. Never fast enough, but a terrific rate. The challenge of the last decade has been that we had a real hard time with regulatory science. It wasn't keeping up with drug development, medical science, bench science. We've caught that up a lot with this legislation, and again, with a change in culture as much as processes at FDA. We can't stop. We need that sustained passion. And just like we saw for the legislation and the effort that went into it from the patient communities, and from probably all of us in the room, that has to continue. We have to stay ahead of it. Otherwise, we're going to be behind the ball again. And if we are, it may be something that in our lifetimes we can't fix, and we certainly know the challenges and the suffering that would happen. I think a challenge, but we've got a great blueprint for it going forward, is working together, especially with the patient communities. We had done such a great job at working with these over 300 patient organizations. We need to continue to do that. Years ago, it used to be, and I used to be solely on the patient side, and it was kind of an us versus them. Hans did a great job of highlighting it when he talked about in his slide. It's not just talking to patients, it's talking to and working with, and we all know it, but we have to live it. I also am partnered with GSK, and like Hans, I would absolutely do that partnership again. We wouldn't be where we are today in our Fabry programs without GSK, but it also brings a host of challenges. So as much as we in biotech need to realize it, I think our partners in pharma also need to realize that in the rare disease field, you've got to talk and work with patients. It is a different field. The last thoughts I'll leave you with is that I do think, actually, for a lot of what we still need to do, the political winds are on our side. It's not just because medicine is good for people. It's because this is innovation, and this is what we do. And the president recently said that innovation is the wellspring of all jobs and prosperity. Half of all of our GDP growth since 1970 has come from inventions and innovation. And we need to remember that we always need to be at the cutting edge of that innovation. And yes, we will have small steps forward in some diseases, but we've got to get back to that notion of risk-taking for all of us. The risk-taking that led to medicines like Kalydeco, that's going to lead to tremendous treatments in Duchenne, muscular dystrophy, and so many areas. And with that, I think we can look back years from now. We may not come to at the end of the day, but at some point we'll come to the end of our careers and think, you know what, maybe for a little bit of time we changed a little part of the world, and that's a good place to be. So those are my perspectives. Thank you.